honestly, I mean, I guess it's kind of 180 because with acapella, it's just voices, so it's kind of it's organic and very vocal in a way there's only so much you can do with that sound, and so it was really fun going into the studio and writing.
She spent 15 years being the only woman in the room, watching everything, saying nothing, and protecting people who were not always protecting her back. At 33, after a broken engagement, a rebuilt life, 2 children, and a solo career she built entirely on her own terms, Kirstin Maldonado finally decided that silence was no longer something she owed anyone. And the name that kept coming up was Mitch Grassi. The cracks that changed everything. Nobody talks about 2017 the way they should, not in the context of Pentatonix, and certainly not in the context of what it cost Kirstin Maldonado personally. Because the public story of that year is about Avi Kaplan leaving the group. The private story is about a woman losing 2 of the most important things in her life at the same time, completely alone, and deciding to turn all of it into music rather than fall apart. Here is the part everyone saw. In May of 2016, her then-boyfriend Jeremy Michael Lewis proposed to her on the Passerelle d'Abyli in Paris, with the Eiffel Tower lit up behind them during the Pentatonix World Tour. When Mitch Grassi posted about the engagement on social media, he did not just say congratulations, he said he had dated Kirstin twice in middle school and was now going to be her bridesmaid. That one sentence tells you everything about the complicated emotional history that had always existed between these 3 people. Kirstin had dated Mitch in middle school. Then she dated Scott Hoying in high school, not knowing at the time what Scott would eventually come to understand about himself. And now, after all of that, the 3 of them were Grammy-winning bandmates, and she was engaged to someone entirely outside of that world. It looked like resolution. It looked like everyone had finally landed where they were supposed to be. Then 2017 arrived. In May of that year, Avi Kaplan stood in front of a camera with his bandmates beside him and announced he was leaving Pentatonix. He was tearful. He called it one of the toughest decisions of his entire life. He said the touring pace, 9 months on the road every year, had ground him down to the point where he simply could not continue. Kirstin, watching him say this in real time, told people that they would have to find a new bass because there are 5 of them. So losing him was losing a 5th of the group. She kept her composure. She always kept her composure. But Avi Kaplan was not just a voice in the lineup. He was a founding member. He was the warm, low anchor that had made the group's sound feel like a home. Losing him changed the architecture of something Kirstin had built her entire adult life inside. And while all of that was happening, her engagement was quietly unraveling behind closed doors. Radar Online reported that the December 2017 wedding had been postponed. An unnamed source confirmed that invitations had not gone out, and the couple were staying together to work on separate issues. No further explanation was ever given publicly. By October of 2017, it was over. Kirstin Maldonado, who had once stood in Paris unable to find words for how happy she was now navigating the collapse of that relationship while simultaneously holding a group together that had just lost its bass vocalist and needed to find someone who could fill a role that fans were already insisting was unfillable. Most people would have gone quiet. Kirstin released music. 1 week after Avi's departure became public, her debut solo single, Break a Little, dropped. She released it under the name Kirstin, all lowercase, no last name. The message was not subtle. She was not Pentatonix's Kirstin Maldonado anymore. She was just Kirstin. Her EPLOVE debuted at #1 on the iTunes Pop Albums chart. Speaking to Yahoo Music around the release, she said something that deserves to be heard very carefully. She said that there was still so much more to her that honestly, people do not get to see, because she was in a group. She had been hiding inside an identity that belonged to all 5 of them. The solo project was the first time she had permission to be only herself. The track Bad Weather was her most pointed statement. She told HuffPost the song was about watching people be hateful on social media, about people disapproving of who you love and who you are. She said it is important to accept yourself and not let hateful talk ruin how special each person is. She was speaking as an ally to Mitch and Scott, but she was also at the same time speaking from somewhere much closer and much more personal than Allied territory. You do not write a song called Bad Weather about people being cruel to you and then describe it as a meditation on your own life experiences unless the weather you are referencing has a face you actually know. And what she was preparing herself to confront next would not just reshape her identity, it would begin to expose the fragile architecture behind the harmony the world believed was unbreakable. The exposure that nobody saw coming. The most dangerous kind of truth is not the one screamed in anger. It is the one spoken calmly, from a place of complete security, by someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose by saying it. That is exactly the position Kirstin Maldonado was in when she began to speak. By the time the story about what had really been happening inside Pentatonix started to surface, Kirstin had already built the life she was always supposed to have. She met Ben Hausdorff in 2018 while he was filming behind-the-scenes footage of Pentatonix recording an album. Pentatonix management had brought him in specifically for the project. He and Kirstin started dating. In March of 2023, she announced on Instagram that he had proposed in Japan, writing that Japan was now forever the best place in the whole wide world. They married on April 21st of 2024 at Divine Grace Vineyard in McKinney, Texas, in front of 175 guests that included all 4 of her bandmates. Their daughter, Eliana Violet, whose delivery Kirstin later described as unexpected and difficult, had been born on June 28th of 2022. Their son, Theo Fortunato, was born on March 2nd of 2025. On Mother's Day of that year, Kirstin posted that life was feeling so beautiful with her family and that there was nothing she would not do for her children. Read that, and then ask yourself what kind of woman Kirstin Maldonado is at 33. She is not bitter. She is not wounded. She is not speaking from a place of grievance or desperation. She is a woman who has won, completely and on her own terms, and who from inside that security finally decided there were things she was no longer willing to protect at the expense of her own truth. What she began to surface was not a single incident. It was a pattern, a way of operating that had existed within the group for years. Mitch Grassi had always presented himself publicly as the free spirit of Pentatonix, the one who dressed however he wanted, said whatever he thought, refused every expectation. But Kirstin had known Mitch Grassi since she was 8 years old. They had done community theater together as children in Arlington. They had been in each other's lives for 25 years. She knew the gap between the public narrative and the private reality in a way that no fan and no journalist ever could. She also knew something that the public did not. She had once dated Mitch in middle school. Then she had dated Scott in high school. These were not small biographical footnotes. They meant that Kirstin Maldonado had emotional histories with 2 of the most powerful figures in the group's internal dynamic before any of them ever stepped onto the sing-off stage. She went into Pentatonix not as a neutral party, but as a woman who had loved both of its most bonded members in different ways at different times, and who had watched both of them eventually find their truths, while she continued to carry everything she had absorbed in the process. Through Bad Weather, Kirstin finally exposed the personal truths she had long kept hidden, and once the carefully protected story cracked, the repercussions began to shake the very foundation of the group, setting the stage for secrets no one was ready to face. The perfect group with imperfect secrets. No one ever asks what it truly costs to maintain the smile we see when Pentatonix appears in yet another Christmas special. Viewers notice the coordinated outfits, the flawless harmonies, the effortless warmth, and they accept it all at face value. What goes unseen is that every detail of that image is carefully constructed, and every construction carries a cost. Pentatonix became the first modern a cappella group to reach #1 on the Billboard 200. They have amassed 5.9 billion YouTube views, earned 3 Grammy Awards, and sell out Christmas tours year after year. In 2025, they signed with Republic Records and released their 7th holiday album, Christmas in the City, featuring a collaboration with a 1960 recording by Frank Sinatra, a track that topped the Billboard Adult Contemporary chart. By every commercial metric, they are the most successful a cappella group the world has ever seen. But the machinery that built that success ran on things nobody was supposed to say out loud. Scott Hoying told the Dallas Voice that after working incredibly hard to come out as gay, he found himself essentially back in the closet again because of the commercial demands of the group's early career. His mother, Connie, released a book in 2025 about that experience. She told Gleyad that when Scott finally came to her, he was super upset and almost sobbing. She had discouraged him from coming out to his classmates because she was trying to protect him. It did not work. A football player at a party called him a slur and told him to get out or he would be beaten. Scott Hoying, one of the most celebrated voices in contemporary a cappella, was threatened with physical violence for being who he was at the school where he and Kirstin and Mitch had all grown up together. Kirstin was in that same town. She was in that same school. She watched all of it and said nothing because there was nothing she could say that would not cost something. The touring pace alone was brutal enough. They released 3 albums in 2014 alone and toured for 9 months every year. Kirstin told CBS News that you never got to recharge and be at home or see your friends or your loved ones. She called it really, really brutal. These are not the words of someone who found the experience straightforward or uncomplicated. These are the words of someone who endured something steadily for years while performing Joy for the World every December. Kevin Olusola carried his own weight. In 2020, he spoke about growing up as a person of color in a country where opportunity is not on equal footing, depending on what you look like, saying he had to work extra hard and put himself out there repeatedly, even while facing criticism for doing so. Matt Sallee walked into the group in 2017 as the replacement for a founding member that portions of the fan base openly grieved, with some Reddit users writing that the group was worse off without Avi. A comment that fans with clearer heads pointed out was an insult to both Matt and to Avi's perfectly valid reasons for leaving. Kirstin carried it all alone, unseen, without a peer, and with a past that made the group's bonds more fragile than anyone realized as the cracks in the perfect image quietly widened, ready to unleash truths no one expected. Mitch Grassi's double life. There is something that gets said about Mitch Grassi in almost every profile ever written about him, and it goes something like this. He is the weird one, the free one, the one who was never going to be normal and was brave enough to stop trying. It is a good story. It is also a story that has always been told entirely from inside his own perspective, by the people who love him. In his own words, what has never been told is the view from the other side of it. Mitch Grassi and Kirstin Maldonado met when they were 8 or 9 years old through the local theater community in Arlington, Texas. They were both doing musical theater. They dated briefly in middle school, which Mitch himself announced publicly when Kirstin got engaged, writing about it on social media with the kind of breezy casualness that someone uses when they know their version of the story is the only version that will be heard. From that beginning, they had a 25-year relationship that included childhood friendship, a middle school romance, a decade of global fame, and something that Kirstin has only recently begun to describe with any real precision. In a 2025 interview with Linsanity, Mitch spoke about what growing up in Arlington actually felt like. He said the culture there was very black and white with no nuance at all. He said he felt very alienated and was questioning his identity a lot. He said the people around him had very close-minded expectations of how a man should act, and he did not meet them. He described years of internal damage that was slow burning rather than sudden. In that same interview, he described himself as someone who has never been the clean-cut, normal member of the band, saying it with a chuckle, wearing it as a badge. But there is something in that framing that deserves a second look. Calling yourself the not normal one is a way of making your difference into a kind of specialness. It centers your experience of being outside the conventional mold as something that happened to you, that you survived, that made you interesting. What it does not account for is the experience of the people who were close to you while that damage was still unprocessed and moving outward. For his solo album Cuts, released under his Messer project in July of 2025, Grassi described doing shadow work for the first time and coming face-to-face with the darker parts of himself. In a Lady Gunn interview, he said that during the making of the track Railway Car, He was really coming face to face with insecurities he had been consciously suppressing for a long time. Insecurities about not being sufficient and not being worthy of love. He described the full process as a bit of an ego death, a loss of identity, the kind of disorienting experience that happens when you finally stop performing around the wounds and start actually looking at them. That is profound. It genuinely is. But here is the part of the shadow work conversation that never gets addressed. When you finally confront your insecurities about not being sufficient and not being worthy of love, that reckoning is with yourself. It does not automatically extend to the people who were on the receiving end of those insecurities while you were still suppressing them. The ego that dies in 2025 was operating for a very long time before it died. And the people who were standing closest to it during that time experienced the weight of it differently than he did. Mitch Grassi began a relationship with German national Wilhelm Will in 2023 after meeting on the European leg of the Pentatonix World Tour. Their long-distance relationship inspired his album Cuts, with the single Not Yet reflecting the pain of waiting to reunite. Grassi later moved temporarily to Berlin, describing the relationship as transformative and deeply self-revealing. While this growth is presented as genuine, Kirstin Maldonado, who knew Grassi before this period, has suggested that his earlier self had a lasting emotional impact on those around him during his process of becoming who he is today. The Brotherhood and the Wall. Scott Hoying and Mitch Grassi briefly dated each other in high school. That fact, confirmed by Wikipedia and by their own community's documented history, is rarely discussed with the weight it deserves in the story of Pentatonix. Because it means that Kirstin Maldonado was not just the only woman in a group with two gay men. She was the only woman in a group where the two most bonded members had each, at different points, been in a romantic relationship with her before any of them were famous, and had then gone on to build the deepest and most protected friendship in the group's entire dynamic with each other instead. Scott came out to Mitch first. They launched Superfruit together, a YouTube channel that gave them a platform to be more authentically themselves in a space that the Pentatonix commercial machinery could not fully reach. The channel gathered 500 million views and 2.4 million subscribers. When Scott released his solo EP Parallel in 2023, he described the lead single Mars as his most personal music to date. When he married Mark Manio in Santa Barbara in July of 2023, Mitch was in the front row. When Scott announced on Dancing with the Stars in October of 2025 that he and Mark were expecting a child through a surrogate, the world celebrated. The arc of Scott Hoying's life from a sobbing young man in his mother's kitchen to that moment on national television is one of the most genuinely moving stories in contemporary pop music. But the path there had costs that were not distributed evenly. When Scott told the Dallas Voice that he was essentially put back in the closet after working so hard to come out, he was describing a commercial requirement that sat on his chest for years. And that same requirement sat on everyone around him, requiring them all to perform a version of togetherness that compressed the truth of the group's internal reality into something broadly appealing and carefully managed. The people who maintained that compression most quietly for the longest period, with the least outside support, were the ones who had the most to carry. Kirstin was that person. She had no creative partner and silently carried the outsider role for 15 years, keeping her full self hidden. And now, as she finally stepped into her own spotlight, the world was about to see just how deep the cracks in the group's perfect image really ran. The outsider within. She once told an interviewer that as long as she had a mirror and a place to change, she was absolutely golden. She said it with a smile. She always said difficult things with a smile. That is the training. That is what you learn when you spend 15 years being the only woman in every room and you decide that the cost of saying what is actually true in any given moment is too high to pay right now. You learn to make the unbearable sound effortless. You learn to smile while you hold it. The structural reality of Kirstin Maldonado's position inside Pentatonix was that she was always outnumbered and never visibly struggling. She was born in Fort Worth, Texas, the daughter of a Spanish-Italian mother and a Mexican father. She sang at her mother's wedding reception at 8 years old and convinced her mother to pay for voice lessons on the spot. She got a full-ride scholarship to the University of Oklahoma as a National Hispanic Scholar, studying musical theater, and dropped out to audition for the Sing-Off. While Scott went to USC and Mitch skipped his actual high school graduation to make the audition, Kirstin walked away from a full scholarship. She sacrificed an enormous amount to be in this group before she ever stepped on the first stage. Once in Los Angeles, she told the Asian fusion girl that it happened so quickly. She went from a college dormitory to being one of the most watched musicians on the internet within a single year. She said the self-conscious issues that came with that transition took years to work through. What kind of self-conscious issues does a woman develop when she arrives in Los Angeles at 19, suddenly famous, surrounded by men, with no equivalent partner in the group, with a complicated personal history with two of the people she is supposed to be a family with, and with the constant implicit requirement to be the supportive, warm, beautiful female presence in every frame? The gap between how her milestones were received and how everyone else's were received tells the story clearly. Scott's coming out became a celebrated cultural moment. Mitch's identity journey became a beloved narrative of personal triumph. Kevin's immigrant family story became the subject of genuine profile coverage. Matt's fan acceptance arc became something people rooted for. Kirstin's broken engagement barely registered. Her #1 debut solo album received a fraction of the coverage of any Pentatonix Christmas release. Her Broadway debut in Kinky Boots in 2018 with Jake Shears and Wayne Brady was noted briefly and then absorbed back into the group's narrative. Even the delivery of her daughter Eliana, which she later described as unexpected and difficult, something she said she and her daughter had really persevered through together, received no significant public acknowledgement from the group or its platform. She was always there. She was always singing. She was always the one making the group sound like a group. And she was consistently the least seen, least celebrated, most taken for granted member of the entity she had helped build from nothing. The silence she had maintained for 15 years was about to break, setting in motion a chain of revelations that would shift everything inside Pentatonix. The fallout. For more than a decade, every word she could have spoken was carefully measured, restrained by the weight of her roles, the histories she had absorbed, and the unspoken expectations around her. Now, as she finally spoke, her revelations began to ripple outward, reaching her bandmates, their allies, and the fans who had never seen the cracks beneath the surface. The Pentatonix fan community, one of the most devoted in contemporary pop music, split immediately and painfully along the lines that these situations always create. There were the fans who protected Mitch. They pointed to his cancer scare in 2016 and the weight loss that worried so many people at the time. They pointed to the years of identity suppression from his conservative upbringing. They pointed to the shadow work, the ego death, the Cuts album, the vulnerability of the railway car track, where he admitted to insecurities about not being sufficient and not being worthy of love. They said this was a man who had suffered and grown and deserved compassion rather than condemnation. And then there were the fans who stood with Kirstin. They did not need to argue very hard. They simply pointed to the timeline. They pointed to the fact that a woman who debuted a #1 album, performed on Broadway, gave birth to 2 children, and built an entirely new life, while continuing to smile through every Pentatonix Christmas tour, did not choose to speak carelessly when she finally chose to speak at all. They pointed to bad weather and what she said about it being a meditation on her own life experiences. They pointed to Break a Little and what it meant that she dropped her last name the week Avi left, as if she had been waiting for exactly that much disruption to give herself permission to step outside of the group's identity entirely. Scott Hoying has been quiet. That silence matters more than most people have acknowledged. Scott Hoying is not a person who stays silent by accident. He has been publicly vocal about his identity, his marriage, his health condition, his DWTS elimination, his upcoming child. His silence on this specific topic, while his best friend is being discussed and his childhood friend is doing the discussing, is the loudest thing in the entire story. Mitch Grassi has continued forward. The album, the relationship with Wilhelm Will, the Berlin performances, the new label deal with Pentatonix, all of it continues. And in every interview he has given about Cuts, and about his shadow work, and about finally facing the parts of himself he had been suppressing, he has spoken with genuine emotional intelligence and real self-awareness. The man who made that album is clearly working through something real and doing it with artistic honesty. But there is a version of shadow work that remains entirely internal, that excavates your own wounds and transforms them into beautiful music, and receives celebration for it without ever turning outward to the people those wounds touched. That version is still incomplete. And Kirstin Maldonado, at 33, with 2 children and a happy marriage, and a #1 album, and a Broadway credit, and a full scholarship she once walked away from because she believed in this group that much, has simply decided she is done waiting for completion that was never coming. She once said that when she started the solo project, she was just so excited and pleasantly surprised by how creative and fun and amazing the entire experience was. What she did not say, but what the music and the timing and the 15 years of practiced silence all say for her, is that the excitement was not just about the music. It was about finally being allowed to exist as only herself, not as the woman who holds it all together, not as the one who absorbs what needs absorbing, not as the keeper of things that were never actually hers to keep. When Kirstin stopped keeping them, the room went very quiet. And in that quiet, for the first time in 15 years, you could finally hear exactly what she had been singing about all along. If this story made you see Pentatonix and the people inside it in a completely different light, drop your honest thoughts in the comments below, because the real conversation about what happened inside that group is only just beginning, and your perspective genuinely matters more than you know.